The winter of 1774 still carried the memory of tea spilled into Boston Harbour. In London, a wounded ministry prepared its answer. On the 31st of March, Parliament passed the Boston Port Act, the first of the measures colonists would soon condemn as intolerable. The statute ordered the harbour closed to all commercial shipping, effective the 1st of June. For the merchants and labourers who had lived off that water for generations, it was a sentence of ruin. Lord North's government designed the law as a precise instrument of retribution, aimed at the town held responsible for destroying property of the East India Company. The reasoning was simple. A town that had permitted lawlessness would bear the cost until order was restored. The port would stay sealed until Boston paid for the ruined tea, and proved that Royal Customs officers could work safely within its bounds. To drive the point home, the Customs House itself was moved to Salem, carrying the machinery of imperial commerce away from the offending capital. The threat was deliberate, and it was severe. Boston lived on the sea, and a sudden stoppage meant idle wharves, empty shops, and hunger across the surrounding region. Parliament passed the measure with broad support and little sympathy. To many members, the destruction of the tea was an assault on private property and imperial law, and firm coercion seemed the only credible reply. The act reflected a hardening mood in London, where patience had worn thin after years of protest, boycott, and open evasion of taxation. Ministers assumed that isolating Boston would divide the colonies, not unite them. They calculated that rival ports, hungry for the trade, suddenly denied their neighbour, would refuse to share the punishment. That assumption would prove profoundly mistaken. The law made no distinction between the guilty and the innocent. Merchants, dock workers, artisans, and ordinary families all faced ruin, whatever their part in the previous December. Many colonists saw the punishment as unjust, for an entire community suffered for the actions of a comparative few. Word of the act reached the colonies over the following weeks, and the reaction ran well beyond Massachusetts. Other provinces saw the dangerous precedent buried in its provisions. If Parliament could close one port and cripple one town by decree, no colonial community could count itself secure. A local dispute was becoming a shared grievance. The measure meant to isolate Boston instead began to forge the very sense of common cause the ministry had hoped to prevent. Closing the port alone would not restore royal authority. Parliament therefore chose to change how Massachusetts itself would be governed. On the 20th of May, 1774, it enacted the Massachusetts Government Act. For generations, New England towns had governed many of their own affairs. Meetings filled with merchants, farmers, and craftsmen decided local questions without waiting for orders from London. The new law changed that tradition almost overnight. Authority shifted away from elected communities and toward royal officials appointed by the Crown. The Act struck first at the Colonial Charter of 1691. Under the old arrangement, the Governor's Council had been chosen by the elected Assembly. The new statute abolished that practice, decreeing that councillors would now be appointed directly by the King. Power that had risen from the colony was now handed down from above. Royal Governor Thomas Gage, who also commanded British forces in North America, gained sharply enlarged authority. He now held firmer control over the appointment and removal of judges, sheriffs, and other officers. Most galling of all, the Act restricted the town meetings through which local communities had long run their affairs. A town could gather only once a year without the governor's written permission, silencing the very forums where resistance had so often taken shape. Gage was further empowered to oversee the selection of jurors, a change colonists feared would bend the courts toward imperial interests. To many, uniting military command and civil government in one man looked less like reform than like military rule. British ministers believed Massachusetts had slid close to anarchy, and that firm structural reform would restore order and reassert the supremacy of Parliament. In their view, the disorder in Boston flowed from a constitution that gave ordinary people too much influence. But this misjudged the colonists entirely. They saw the rewriting of their charter not as a remedy, but as a naked assault on liberties they believed inviolable. And the danger ran deeper than any single clause. For the Act proved that Parliament claimed the power to rewrite a colonial charter whenever it judged the moment convenient. Colonists in the other provinces recognized that precedent with alarm. If the framework of one colony could be dismantled by decree, no charter anywhere in North America stood truly secure. That fear began to knit distant colonies together. It also made Massachusetts governable only by force, because the new officials commanded almost no consent. Communities refused to recognize the Crown-appointed councillors. In town after town, crowds surrounded their homes until the frightened men resigned their commissions or fled to Boston under British protection. The gap between what Parliament could legislate and what it could enforce now lay open for all to see. On the same day, the 20th of May, another statute received royal assent. The Administration of Justice Act let the governor move certain trials out of the colony whenever he judged that an impartial hearing could not be had within its borders. It applied to royal officials, soldiers, and other agents of the Crown, accused of capital crimes while enforcing the law or putting down riots. Such men could be sent to another colony, or to Britain itself, where sympathetic juries and distant courtrooms were far more likely to acquit. Supporters in London reasoned that officers sent to suppress colonial unrest could hardly expect fair treatment from Massachusetts juries drawn from seething towns. To the colonists, the logic ran exactly the other way. Moving trials placed royal agents beyond local accountability. A soldier who killed a colonist might be carried across the ocean, tried far from any witness willing to testify, and shielded by the sheer cost of sending evidence abroad. To many, that was an open invitation to violence. They gave the statute a bitter name. They called it the Murder Act. The measure struck at a principle the colonists had come to treasure: the right to be judged by a jury of one's neighbours in the place where the offence occurred. By severing crime from community, it seemed to overturn a foundational guarantee of English liberty. For a people already alarmed by the shuttered harbour and the rewritten charter, this fresh intrusion confirmed a pattern. Parliament seemed determined to strip away one safeguard after another. Colonial writers seized on the acts as proof that their liberties rested on precarious ground, subject to suspension whenever London found it convenient. On the 2nd of June, Parliament passed a new Quartering Act, widening the old billeting rules into a general framework for the whole mainland. Earlier quartering laws had proven clumsy, easily obstructed by assemblies reluctant to fund the housing of regular troops. Under those rules, soldiers went into barracks and public houses first, a sequence officials often manipulated to delay compliance. The new statute let colonial governors, rather than local assemblies, requisition suitable empty buildings when no other quarters were available. That shift mattered enormously, because it took a lever of resistance out of provincial hands and gave practical control to royally appointed executives. The timing gave the law a sharper edge. It arrived as forces gathered in Massachusetts and the campaign to coerce Boston intensified. Colonists did not read these acts in isolation. Many saw the measure as one more part of a coordinated design to plant a standing army among them without the consent of their representatives. The fear of a permanent peacetime army ran deep in English political thought, where such forces were linked to tyranny and the erosion of liberty. American writers drew freely on that tradition. Because this act applied across British America rather than punishing one town, its warning carried far. Assemblies in distant provinces understood that the power to quarter soldiers by executive order could be turned against them just as readily as against Boston. The practical effect was modest at first, since most troops stayed where unrest was greatest, yet the symbolic weight far outran the immediate application. In pamphlets and newspapers, the measures were named together: the closed port, the rewritten government, the quartering of troops, as proof that Britain had traded persuasion for compulsion backed by bayonets. Then Parliament turned northward. On the 22nd of June, it passed the Quebec Act, a law separate in origin from the punitive measures aimed at Boston, yet quickly folded by colonists into the same catalogue of grievances. Ministers had wrestled for years with how to govern a vast region filled overwhelmingly with French-speaking Catholics unused to English ways. Rather than impose an assembly dominated by a tiny Protestant minority, the Act set up government by an appointed governor and council, dispensing with the representative body colonists regarded as essential to legitimate rule. It restored French civil law for private disputes while keeping English criminal law. Most striking to observers in the older colonies was the guarantee of the free exercise of the Roman Catholic religion, allowing the Church to collect its customary tithes and securing the position of its clergy. In an age when anti-Catholic feeling ran deep across Protestant America, this struck many as an alarming endorsement of a faith they tied to tyranny and the absolute monarchies of Europe. The Act carried a further blow. It enlarged Quebec dramatically, extending the province south and west to take in the enormous territory between the Ohio and the Mississippi, land that several seaboard colonies had long claimed under their original charters. Colonial leaders read the statute not as routine administration, but as a deliberate design to hem in the older colonies while rewarding a Catholic population with privileges denied to Protestant Englishmen. The timing proved disastrous for imperial harmony, for it reached America almost together with the Acts punishing Massachusetts, blurring any line between them in the colonial mind. From the ministry's side, the Act was a reasonable effort to govern a distinct people by their own customs, a calculation that proved sound when Canada later declined to join the rebellion. Between these two views lay a widening gulf. As summer came, the machinery of retribution moved from debate in London to hard reality on the wharves. On the 1st of June, 1774, the Boston Port Act took formal effect, and the commercial life that had defined the town for generations came to an abrupt halt. Royal Navy vessels took station across the approaches, turning a harbour once thick with masts and cargo into a policed and silent stretch of water. Parliament designated Marblehead as an alternative port for lawful commerce, and Salem as the seat of customs, redirecting the region's trade to underscore Boston's isolation and disgrace. The consequences fell at once on people whose livelihood came almost entirely from the sea. Merchants, dockworkers, sailmakers, and countless labourers found their work suspended without warning. Provisions grew uncertain as the ordinary channels of supply narrowed, and the prospect of a long winter without trade raised real fears of scarcity. The closure struck not only the wealthy traders who had defied imperial policy, but also the humbler families who had played no part in the tea's destruction. That severity, falling on guilty and innocent alike, began to reshape how the colonies saw Boston, less a lawless troublemaker, more a community punished for a principle. News of the closure travelled outward along the roads and coastal routes, carried by riders and correspondence networks matured in the earlier fight over taxation. Sympathetic communities answered with solidarity. From New Hampshire to Georgia, towns organised collections for Boston, sending food, livestock, fuel, and money to families they had never met. The 1st of June took on symbolic weight, marked in some places with fasting and solemn assembly, as mourning for liberties under assault. Committees of correspondence seized the moment to argue that an injury to one colony endangered all. The ministry's bet that isolation would breed surrender proved profoundly wrong. The coercive laws did not silence Massachusetts. They pushed its people toward an unprecedented experiment in governing themselves beyond royal authority. Across the colony's villages and market towns, ordinary inhabitants faced a stark reality, because the Government Act had gutted the elected institutions that had long carried community consent. Rather than submit to a Crown-appointed council and to town meetings limited by decree, communities began to build extra-legal committees that took up the functions once held by lawful provincial bodies. The committees of correspondence, born in earlier resistance, now expanded dramatically, linking distant towns into a network that could share news and mobilize action swiftly. When newly appointed councillors accepted their posts under the hated statute, crowds gathered in town after town to demand they resign, often surrounding their homes until the frightened men publicly gave up their offices. The pressure worked. By late summer, the royally sanctioned government existed largely on paper, unable to function outside the immediate protection of British troops in Boston. In the western counties especially, thousands of farmers and townsmen assembled to shut down the county courts, refusing to let judges sit under authority drawn from Parliament rather than from the people. These closures were done without bloodshed, through sheer numbers and disciplined resolve. The machinery of imperial justice could be paralysed simply by the withdrawal of ordinary cooperation. The committees justified themselves with a clear argument. When legitimate government was destroyed by unconstitutional acts, sovereignty returned to the people, who could raise new instruments of order. That reasoning turned scattered protest into a coherent movement, one that increasingly worked as a shadow government commanding real allegiance across the countryside. The committees enforced boycotts of British goods, watched the conduct of suspected loyalists, and pressed merchants to hold to the resolutions of their neighbours. Those who resisted met social ostracism, economic boycott, and occasional public humiliation, pressure that enforced unity without any court or musket. General Thomas Gage, serving as royal governor, reported with growing alarm that his real control reached little beyond Boston, where his soldiers could guarantee obedience only within a narrow perimeter. What made the transformation so striking was its grassroots character. The push came not from a handful of leaders, but from countless communities acting together through their chosen committees. By the first days of August, Massachusetts had begun to function as a society organized around institutions of its own making, a bold rejection of the framework imposed from London. The coercive acts, meant to isolate and punish Boston, had instead bound the colony together in determined resistance. The coercive acts had done more than reshape one colony. They had convinced the others that a blow struck at Massachusetts could fall on any of them. Committees of correspondence carried that fear from province to province, and colony after colony agreed to send delegates to a single assembly. If Parliament could punish one town by decree, then only a united answer could meet it. What had begun as Boston's crisis was fast becoming America's. On the 5th of September, 1774, delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies gathered in Philadelphia. Only Georgia stayed away. Men who had never worked together, drawn from provinces with little in common, now sat in one room to decide how 13 separate colonies should answer the power of an empire. Behind them lay a silent port, a rewritten charter, and a Massachusetts that already governed itself through committees of its own making. Every measure intended to restore imperial authority had instead driven the colonies closer together. The acts designed to isolate Boston had given that unity its voice in the First Continental Congress. There, 13 colonies would attempt what they had never done before, to speak as one. That story begins next.